By the last week of May 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had a problem with its submarines that nobody in Tokyo could explain. Boats sent into open water, hundreds of miles from any reported enemy, were going off the air one after another and not coming back. No distress call, no sighting report, no wreckage anyone could point to. A vessel would take up its assigned station on the surface of an ocean that looked empty, and then it would stop existing, and the officers at headquarters, plotting little marks on a chart, would wait for a transmission that never came. Here is the shape of what was happening to them, though the command in Tokyo did not yet see it. In the middle of that month, a line of their boats lay strung out on patrol north of the Admiralty Islands, spaced at intervals to catch any American fleet that came through. Within 12 days, most of the line was gone. 6 boats were destroyed in that stretch of late May, and 5 of the 6 went down under a single American warship, a destroyer escort named England, a type built for the drudgery of shepherding convoys, a quarter smaller than a proper destroyer, with a crew under 200 and a main battery of 3 modest guns. It was not a glamorous ship. It became in less than 2 weeks the deadliest submarine killer the war would ever produce, and it managed that because someone had handed it the enemy's own orders. The ocean those boats were patrolling was not empty. It only looked that way from inside them. It had not always run this way for them, which is the part worth holding on to, because it is what makes the fall so strange. Japan had entered the war with one of the most formidable submarine arms on Earth. Her fleet boats had the longest reach of any in the world, far enough to cross the Pacific and loiter off the American coast, which some of them did in the opening weeks. They carried the oxygen-driven Type 95 torpedo, a weapon with more range and a fainter wake than anything the United States Navy put in the water. For a season in 1942, these boats were not the ones vanishing. They were doing it to somebody else. The high water mark came in a few months of that year. At midway in June, after American dive bombers had wrecked the carrier Yorktown and left her drifting, it was a submarine I-168 that slipped inside the screen and put the torpedoes into her that finished her, taking a destroyer down beside her. 3 months later, off Guadalcanal, a boat called I-19 fired a single fan of 6 torpedoes at an American task force from around 1,000 yards. 3 struck the carrier Wasp and set off her fuel and her magazines, and she burned until her own screen had to scuttle her. The other 3 ran on for miles into a second formation and found the battleship North Carolina and the destroyer O'Brien, holding the first and dooming the second to founder weeks later. 1 boat, 1 salvo, a carrier and a destroyer sunk, and a battleship crippled. It stands as one of the most destructive torpedo attacks any submarine has ever made. So the question is not why a weak force failed, it is why a dangerous one was turned into prey. And the first answer lies in a way of thinking about war that was already old. Japanese doctrine had been built around a single idea, drawn from the crushing victory over the Russians at Tsushima in 1905, that a war at sea would be settled by one enormous clash of battle fleets, and that everything should bend toward winning that clash. Submarines in this scheme were not raiders sent to strangle an enemy's shipping. They were scouts and skirmishers for the main fleet, meant to find warships, shadow them, and thin them with torpedoes before the decisive day. The one thing the Imperial Navy almost never did was turn its long-range boats loose on the thin, enormous American supply lines that a handful of them could have bled, the way the U-boats bled the Atlantic and the way American submarines were, at that very moment, strangling Japan. There was a second use the boats were put to, and it was worse. When the fight for Guadalcanal turned against Japan late in 1942 and the garrison there began to starve, the Army leaned on the Navy to feed it, and boats were pulled off warlike work to run rice and ammunition up to the island by night. From there, the habit spread, and as the American advance rolled westward and left whole garrisons stranded on bypassed islands, the largest ocean-going boats were turned into freighters, hauling supplies to troops the fleet could no longer reach any other way. A submarine makes a poor cargo ship. Worse, a supply run goes to a fixed place on a schedule, which is to say it goes to a place the other side can predict. The misuse ran deep enough that the Navy began building for it. By 1943, the yards were laying down whole classes of purpose-made transport submarines. Cargo carriers with too little armament to defend themselves, and drawing up orders for scores more because so many fighting boats were being spent hauling freight to islands the fleet had already lost the sea around. The boats best suited to hunting were the very ones most often pulled away to carry rice, and a first-rate submarine force was redesigning itself into a fleet of blockade runners. And prediction was the whole game, because this is the thing the officers plotting those little marks in Tokyo never let themselves believe. The Americans were reading their mail. Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, the code outfit at Pearl Harbor, had been picking apart Japanese naval traffic for years, and on the 13th of May, its analysts pulled apart a signal from the submarine I-16 that laid out a rice delivery to the garrison at Buin in usable detail, where the boat was headed and roughly when. 3 destroyer escorts were sent to wait for it. The boat was not found by luck or by an alert lookout catching a periscope in a wide sea. It was found because its own Navy had told the Americans where to look, in a cipher the Americans had solved, and it sailed to the map coordinates of its own death with no notion that anyone was there. That was how the boats were vanishing, and once a boat was found, it was easier to kill than its crew knew. The great virtue of the Japanese fleet submarine, its size, was also its curse. It was long and slow to submerge, hard to handle underwater, and simple to hold on sonar, with a hull that could not go as deep or take as much punishment as a German one. It showed up well on radar, at a time when its own Navy carried no search radar at all until the summer of 1944, and never a set to match what the hunters had. A boat that could be seen first, tracked without much trouble, and struck at depths it could not escape, was already living on borrowed time before anyone read a word of its mail. The escort that met I-16 was the England, named for a young ensign killed aboard the battleship Oklahoma at Pearl Harbor, a ship that carried a dead man's name from the first day of the war out to collect on it. She found the boat in calm, sunny weather on the 18th of May and made a hash of the first 4 tries. Her forward mortar missed again, then missed a third time because the crew had set the attack for 200 feet when the boat was nearer 325, a depth they learned from the fathometer after the bombs had already fallen. The Japanese captain fought the whole way, tucking his boat into the England's own wake, where the sonar went deaf against the escort's propellers, and it came with a hair of saving him. On the 5th run, the mortar found the hull. A string of blasts was followed by an explosion so large it lifted the England's stern clear of the water and threw men off their feet, and I-16 was gone with every man aboard her, rice and all. If you are the kind of person who wants to know how something like this was even possible, you are already in the right place. Subscribe, and we will keep pulling these apart, one impossible-sounding story at a time. Reading the enemy's orders had put the escort in the right patch of water. The weapon it carried let it finish the job. Older escorts hunted a boat by running straight over it and rolling depth charges off the stern, which meant losing the target on sonar in the last seconds before the attack, at the worst possible moment. The England carried a Hedgehog, a mortar that threw a spread of 24 small bombs ahead of the ship into the water where the sonar could still hear the boat, and those bombs went off only when they struck a hull. A miss made no sound and gave nothing away, while a hit meant a hole in a pressure hull a few hundred feet down, sea, and a hole like that meant a dead boat and every man inside it. The rice run was the overture. On the 20th of May, the code unit at Pearl Harbor broke a second message, and this one was worth far more than a freighter's cargo. It gave up an entire patrol line, a screen of boats from Rear Admiral Owada's 7th Submarine Squadron laid across a stretch of sea north of the Admiralties that Admiral Halsey's fleet had crossed twice before, set there to raise the alarm when the Americans came through again. 7 boats were named to that line, though accounts differ on how many were on station when the sweep began. The England and her 2 companions, George and Raby, were sent to take it apart from one end to the other, and that is what they did. RO-106 went down on the 22nd, RO-104 on the 23rd, RO-116 on the 24th, RO-108 on the 26th, and RO-105 on the 31st. Not one of these was an easy kill. Against RO-104, the George and the Raby made 8 attacks over 2 hours and missed with all of them before the England came up and settled the boat on her second try. What the boats could not do was warn each other because To break radio silence was to announce a position, and a position was the one thing that kept getting them killed. It is worth being clear that this was not the luck of one gifted ship. Halfway through the killing, a full hunter-killer group built around the escort carrier Hoggett Bay arrived to take over the hunt, and the England broke off to run into Manus for a fresh load of Hedgehog bombs before coming back out to finish the last boat on the line. Behind the three escorts sat the whole apparatus: the code unit, the radar, the carrier aircraft, the stockpiles of ammunition, a machine that could be aimed at a set of coordinates, and would grind at them until the water was empty. When it was over, the chief of American naval operations, Admiral King, promised there would always be a ship named England in his navy, and the little escort took a presidential citation for a feat no vessel matched in the war. One small ship, built to escort convoys, had destroyed 6 submarines in 12 days and come through it without a wound worth the name. And it was not only the England or only that stretch of water. A month later, in the Atlantic, a lone Japanese boat called I-52 was running to Germany with a cargo of rubber and gold and quinine and a handful of engineers sent to study German technology when the same machine closed on her. Her schedule had been read from her own Navy's signals. Aircraft from an American escort carrier, the Bogue, found her at night by radar far out over open sea. Sonobuoys tracked her beneath the surface once she dived, and a torpedo that steered itself toward the sound of her propellers finished the job. Not one of those things could the Japanese Navy do in return, and I-52 went down 800 miles from the nearest land, as unseen and as complete as any loss on the picket line. Somewhere in that tally is a boat called RO-116, lost with all 56 of the men aboard her north of the Admiralty Islands. The Imperial Navy did not strike her from its rolls until the 25th of June, a month after the England's bombs opened her hull. For that month, she was neither afloat nor accounted for, only a name on a patrol line that had stopped answering, one of a growing number of boats the Navy carried as overdue while it waited for reports that were never going to come. Those 56 were the ordinary arithmetic of the thing. Every mark that went quiet on the chart in Tokyo was a crew. The most damning part is not that the boats died. It is what failed to happen afterward. The men on the surviving boats were not fools, and at least one account of these weeks holds that submarines on the line picked up American radio traffic themselves, signals that pointed a trap closing around them. The exact picture is hard to reconstruct now, because the Japanese submarine records of 1944 are thin, and some of what survives is secondhand. What is clear is that no general warning went out to pull the boats off their stations, or scatter them, or change the plan. Headquarters had built a line, the line was being eaten, and the answer was to leave the remaining boats sitting on it. A navy that could not see the cause of its losses could hardly be expected to cure it, but this was something worse. Pieces of the answer were arriving, and nobody assembled them. All of which leads back to the question the Imperial Navy kept not answering. Why were the boats vanishing? The Navy held a deep, nearly religious confidence that its codes could not be read, and that faith had already survived direct evidence against it. A year earlier, American fighters had ambushed and killed Admiral Yamamoto over Bougainville after his itinerary went out by radio. And the Navy's own inquiry blamed not the broken code but a rival service for resending the schedule in a weaker cipher. The system itself was pronounced sound. Faced with the same fork again over the submarines, between admitting a catastrophe it could not undo and reaching instead for chance, enemy skill, better radar, anything else at all, the Navy reached for anything else. The destroyed patrol line did more harm than the loss of 6 boats. It lied to the man who had said it. Admiral Toyota had strung those submarines across the sea to tell him where the next American blow would land, and when the line fell silent and his scouts reported a heavy buildup at Manus, he read the two facts together and decided the enemy was massing to strike the Palau Islands. He moved his fleet to meet them there. The blow did not fall on Palau. Just over 2 weeks after the England finished the line, the Americans came ashore in the Marianas at Saipan, and the Japanese fleet was in the wrong ocean. The picket line had cost Toyota his eyes, and then it had cost him worse, because a blind man knows that he is blind, and Toyota believed he could see. The numbers at the end tell the size of it. Japan sent about 170 submarines to war and lost roughly 130 of them, 3/4 of the force. a rate of loss close to what the German U-boats suffered. Of the 30 boats that had screened the attack on Pearl Harbor, not one came home. By the last August of the war, the Imperial Navy had 7 submarines left that could still put to sea. A fleet that had begun the war able to strike the American coast ended it unable to keep boats alive within reach of its own harbors. There is a last chapter that shows how far the arm had fallen. By late 1944, the Navy that had once put 6 torpedoes into a task force and sunk 3 ships was reduced to a different use for the same fine oxygen torpedoes. It hollowed them out, sat a man inside each one with a periscope and 1.5 tons of explosive, and called the thing a chitin, a human torpedo. He would ride into a hull and never leave. The first of them went out in November 1944 and drowned a fleet oiler, the Mississiniwa, at anchor in Ulithi Lagoon. In all the months that followed, they sank 3 American ships in total. For every enemy sailor a chitin killed, something close to 4 Japanese submariners died, most of them going down with the mother boats that carried the weapons, and one of those first mother boats, I-37, was hunted down off the islands by Hedgehog fire from a pair of destroyer escorts, the same weapon and the same kind of ship that had gutted the picket line. The force that had finished Yorktown was now spending its men a torpedo at a time, and still it was vanishing. None of this was the failure of a bad navy or a timid one. The submarine arm was large, well-built, and in places ahead of its time. These were the men who built the biggest boats in the world, the aircraft-carrying I-400 giants that would not be exceeded in size until the nuclear age, and whose crews were brave to the edge of recklessness, as the captain of I-16 had shown in the England's wake. What beat them was not a shortage of skill or nerve, but a doctrine that placed them in predictable spots, a supply run that chained them to fixed points on a timetable, a wall of American technology their own boats could not match, and over all of it, a broken code the Navy would not admit was broken. For everything it was, the whole force sank around 1 million tons of merchant shipping in the war, fewer than 200 ships, while American boats sank better than 5 times as much. The boats went on vanishing to the end. Through the summer and into the autumn of 1944, the escorts kept finding them, off Saipan and Guam, and in the waters toward Palau, killing them in 1s and 2s with the same weapons and the same intelligence, and the pattern never broke because the thing driving it was never named. When the war ended, the men who might have pressed the hard question about the ciphers had mostly gone to the bottom with their boats, or lived on, still sure the codes had held. RO-116 was struck from the rolls, and crews like hers were counted in the thousands, and no reckoning was ever made of why. The ocean had not been empty. It never was. The Navy simply went to its grave calling the thing that killed it bad luck.